What if I told you that one single enslaved person in Boston was responsible for the freedom of thousands? What if I revealed that this one act of defiance changed the course of American history forever? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most incredible, yet largely forgotten stories of courage that sparked a revolution against one of humanity's darkest institutions. This is the story of how one person's brave stand shook the foundations of an entire system and ignited a fire that would eventually consume the chains of bondage across a nation. Boston, in the mid-18th century, was a city of contradictions. It was a bustling port, a center of commerce and Enlightenment thinking, yet it was also a place where human beings were bought and sold as property. The institution of enslavement had taken root in the American colonies, and Massachusetts was no exception. While the numbers of enslaved people in New England were smaller compared to the southern plantation economies, the practice was deeply embedded in the social and economic fabric of the region. Wealthy merchants, ship captains, and even some clergy owned enslaved individuals who worked in homes, on docks, and in various trades throughout the city. The year 1770 marked a turning point in American history. Tensions between the colonists and British authorities were reaching a boiling point. British soldiers occupied Boston, and the atmosphere was thick with resentment and anger. The colonists felt oppressed by taxation without representation, by the presence of armed troops in their streets, and by what they perceived as tyranny from across the Atlantic. But within this struggle for colonial liberty, there existed a profound irony that many enslaved people of the time could see clearly. Those who cried loudest for their own freedom denied that same freedom to others based solely on the color of their skin. Into this volatile mix stepped a man whose name would become legendary, though his full story remains shrouded in some mystery. Crispus Attucks was a man of African and Native American descent who had escaped from enslavement approximately 20 years earlier. Standing over 6 feet tall with a powerful build, Attucks had worked as a sailor and rope maker, moving between various port cities and avoiding capture. He understood what it meant to live without freedom, and he understood the value of liberty in a way that few of his contemporaries could truly grasp. Unlike many who merely talked about freedom, Attucks had risked everything to claim his own. On the evening of March 5, 1770, the streets of Boston were covered in snow and ice. A group of colonists had gathered near the Custom House on King Street, confronting a British sentry. The crowd grew larger and more agitated. Insults were hurled, snowballs and chunks of ice were thrown, and the tension escalated by the minute. British soldiers arrived to support their comrade, forming a semicircle with fixed bayonets. The crowd pressed forward, daring the soldiers to fire. In that moment, at the front of that angry crowd, stood Crispus Attucks. Before we continue with this incredible story, I want to ask you something. If you're finding this fascinating, if you want to hear more untold stories from history that challenge everything you thought you knew, then please hit that subscribe button right now. Click the like button to help others discover this story and share this video with someone who loves history. Your support helps us bring these forgotten heroes back to life. Now let's get back to that fateful night in Boston. Historical accounts vary on exactly what happened next, but what we know is this: Crispus Attucks confronted the soldiers directly. Some witnesses reported that he grabbed a bayonet, others said he struck at the soldiers with a stick. What is certain is that Attucks showed no fear. He stood at the front, leading by example, refusing to back down in the face of armed military power. Then, in a moment that would echo through the ages, shots rang out. The British soldiers fired into the crowd. Crispus Attucks was the first to fall, struck twice in the chest. He died instantly, becoming the first casualty of what would soon be called the Boston Massacre. But Attucks did not die alone that night. Samuel Gray, a rope maker, fell dead beside him. James Caldwell, a sailor, was killed by 2 bullets. Samuel Maverick, a 17-year-old apprentice, was mortally wounded and died the next morning. Patrick Carr, an Irish immigrant, lingered for days before succumbing to his injuries. 5 men died that night, but it was the death of Crispus Attucks that carried a particular weight and symbolism. Here was a man who had escaped bondage, who had lived in defiance of a system that claimed ownership over human beings, and who had given his life standing against tyranny. The irony was not lost on many observers, then or now. The aftermath of the Boston Massacre was immediate and explosive. The death of these 5 men became a rallying cry for the colonial cause. Paul Revere created an engraving of the event that circulated throughout the colonies, depicting the British soldiers as brutal aggressors firing on innocent citizens. While Revere's depiction took some artistic liberties, including not showing Attucks as a man of color, the image became one of the most powerful pieces of propaganda in the lead-up to the American Revolution. The colonial press published detailed accounts of the massacre, each one emphasizing the innocence of the victims and the tyranny of British rule. The funeral for the victims was an extraordinary event. On March 8, 1770, thousands of Bostonians turned out to honor the dead. The shops were closed, church bells tolled throughout the city, and a procession of unprecedented size wound through the streets. Crispus Attucks, along with the other victims, was buried in the granary burying ground, normally reserved for the prominent citizens of Boston. This was significant because Attucks, as a man of color and a former enslaved person, would typically have been denied such honor. His burial alongside the other victims was a powerful statement about sacrifice, citizenship, and the common cause of liberty. The trial of the British soldiers who fired that night was equally significant. The soldiers were defended by none other than John Adams, future President of the United States, who took the case to prove that even in revolutionary times, the rule of law must prevail. The trial was controversial, and the outcome even more so. Most of the soldiers were acquitted, with 2 found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. They were branded on their thumbs and released. Many colonists were outraged by the verdict, but the trial itself demonstrated that the colonies were capable of administering justice according to law rather than mob rule. What made Crispus Attucks' sacrifice so powerful was not just his death, but what it represented. Here was a man who had broken the chains of enslavement and had lived as a free individual for 2 decades. He had every reason to stay out of trouble, to keep his head down and avoid confrontation with authorities who might discover his past. Instead, he chose to stand up. He chose to be at the front of that crowd. He chose to face armed soldiers rather than accept injustice. His actions embodied the very principles that the American revolutionaries claimed to hold dear: that all people are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The story of Crispus Attucks became a powerful tool in the abolitionist movement that would gain strength in the decades following the Revolution. Abolitionists pointed to Attucks as proof that people of African descent were equally capable of courage, patriotism, and sacrifice. They asked the difficult question that many Americans preferred to avoid: how could a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal continue to hold millions in bondage? How could the same people who celebrated Crispus Attucks as a hero of the Revolution deny freedom to those who shared his heritage? The abolition movement in Boston grew stronger as the years passed. The city that had witnessed the sacrifice of Crispus Attucks became one of the most important centers of anti-slavery activism in America. Organizations like the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, founded in 1831, worked tirelessly to end the practice of enslavement. They published newspapers, organized lectures, provided assistance to those escaping bondage through the Underground Railroad, and lobbied for legislative change. Boston became a beacon of hope for those seeking freedom, a place where the ideals of liberty were taken seriously enough that people were willing to fight for them. The influence of Attucks' sacrifice extended far beyond Boston. His story was told and retold throughout the northern states, inspiring others to join the cause of abolition. Frederick Douglass, the great orator and former enslaved person who became one of the most influential voices for freedom, often invoked the name of Crispus Attucks in his speeches. Douglass understood that Attucks represented something crucial. Proof that black Americans had been patriots from the very beginning, that they had shed their blood for American independence long before they were granted the rights and recognition they deserved. We're about halfway through this incredible journey, and I hope you're as moved by this story as I am. If you haven't already, this is the perfect time to show your support. Hit that like button if you believe stories like this deserve to be told. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another untold story from history. And please share this video with your friends, your family, your social media followers. These stories have power, but only if people hear them. Let's continue. The legal landscape regarding enslavement began to shift in Massachusetts, partly due to the contradictions highlighted by cases and stories like that of Crispus Attucks. In 1783, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court heard the case of Quock Walker, an enslaved man who sued for his freedom. Chief Justice William Cushing instructed the jury that enslavement was incompatible with the Massachusetts Constitution, which had been adopted in 1780, and declared that all men are born free and equal. The Walker case effectively ended legal enslavement in Massachusetts, making it one of the first states to abolish the practice. This legal victory did not come from nowhere. It was built on decades of activism, argument, and the power of examples like Crispus Attucks. The people who fought for Walker's freedom could point to the revolution and ask, what were we fighting for, if not the principle that all people deserve liberty? How could Massachusetts celebrate its role in founding a free nation while keeping any of its inhabitants in chains? The case of Quock Walker was a direct descendant of the ideals that Crispus Attucks had died defending. The impact of one person's courage rippled through time in unexpected ways. The story of the Boston Massacre and Crispus Attucks became part of the educational curriculum in many northern schools. Children learned about the brave men who stood up to British tyranny, and they learned that one of those men was a person of African and Native American descent who had escaped from enslavement. This education helped shape the attitudes of a new generation that would ultimately fight to end bondage throughout the nation. The abolitionist newspapers of the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s frequently published accounts of the Boston Massacre, always making sure to highlight the role of Crispus Attucks. The Liberator, published by William Lloyd Garrison in Boston starting in 1831, was particularly influential in keeping Attucks' memory alive. Garrison understood the power of historical examples and used them effectively to argue for immediate abolition. He would ask his readers, if Crispus Attucks was American enough to die for this country's freedom, why are his descendants still held in chains? Why are they denied citizenship, education, and basic human rights? The personal stories of those affected by the growing abolitionist movement are as powerful as the political and legal changes. Imagine you are an enslaved person in the 1840s, laboring on a plantation in Virginia or Georgia. You hear whispered stories of a place called Boston, where people of color can walk free, where there are churches and schools that welcome them, where the law protects their liberty. You hear about the Underground Railroad, the network of safe houses and brave conductors who help people escape to freedom. And you hear about Crispus Attucks, a man who was once enslaved just like you, but who escaped and lived free, and who ultimately gave his life for the cause of liberty. These stories provide hope. They provide proof that freedom is possible. They inspire people to take incredible risks to claim their own liberty. The routes of the Underground Railroad often led to Boston and other Massachusetts cities. Conductors like Harriet Tubman, who made 19 trips back to the South and helped approximately 300 people escape, often brought freedom seekers to Boston where they could find safety and support. The city had organizations specifically designed to help newly arrived freedom seekers find housing, employment, and education. Churches opened their doors, providing sanctuary and community. Boston's free black community, which had been growing since the late 1700s, welcomed newcomers and helped them build new lives. One of the most remarkable aspects of the abolitionist movement in Boston was the way it brought together people from different backgrounds. White abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips worked alongside black activists like David Walker and Lewis Hayden. Women like Maria Stewart and Lydia Maria Child played crucial roles in the movement, writing, speaking, and organizing despite the social restrictions placed on women at the time. This coalition understood that the fight for freedom was everyone's fight, that injustice anywhere was a threat to justice everywhere. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 posed a new challenge to the abolitionist movement and to the free black community in Boston. This federal law required that escaped enslaved people be returned to their owners, even if they had reached free states. It mandated that citizens assist in the capture of fugitives and imposed penalties on anyone who aided their escape. The law was an outrage to many Bostonians who saw it as federal overreach and a betrayal of the principles of liberty. The response in Boston was swift and organized. Vigilance committees were formed to protect freedom seekers from capture. Church bells would ring to alert the community when slave catchers were in the city, and crowds would gather to prevent captures. Several dramatic rescues took place in Boston. In 1851, a freedom seeker named Shadrach Minkins was arrested and taken to the federal courthouse. A group of black activists stormed the building, overpowered the guards, and spirited Minkins away to Canada, where he could live in safety. Later that same year, another freedom seeker named Thomas Sims was not so fortunate. Despite massive protests and attempts at rescue, Sims was returned to bondage in Georgia under heavy military guard. These events galvanized the abolitionist movement and demonstrated that the fight for freedom required constant vigilance and courage. The legacy of Crispus Attucks continued to inspire throughout these turbulent decades. Abolitionists would organize commemorations of the Boston Massacre on March 5th each year, using the occasion to draw explicit connections between the colonial fight for independence and the ongoing struggle to end enslavement. Speakers at these events would remind their audiences that Attucks had not died so that some Americans could be free while others remained in chains. They argued that the revolution would remain incomplete until every person in America enjoyed the liberty that Attucks had died defending. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 brought these questions to a head. Initially, President Lincoln framed the war as a fight to preserve the Union, not to end enslavement. But as the war progressed and black Americans pressed for the right to fight for their own freedom, the purpose of the war evolved. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in rebel states were free. While limited in its immediate practical effect, the proclamation fundamentally changed the nature of the war. It became a war for freedom, a war to finally fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence. Black soldiers played a crucial role in winning the Civil War. Over 180,000 black men served in the United States colored troops, fighting with extraordinary courage and determination. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first official black units in the Union Army, was recruited in Boston and included 2 sons of Frederick Douglass. When these soldiers marched through Boston on their way to war, they passed by monuments and markers commemorating Crispus Attucks and the Boston Massacre. The connection was clear. They were following in Attucks's footsteps, putting their lives on the line for the cause of freedom. The 54th Massachusetts would prove its valor at the assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina in July 1863. Leading the charge against a heavily fortified Confederate position, the regiment suffered tremendous casualties, but fought with such courage that they dispelled any lingering doubts about the fighting ability and commitment of black soldiers. Their commander, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, died in the assault alongside many of his men. The battle became legendary, immortalized in books, speeches, and eventually in film. The soldiers of the 54th were consciously connecting themselves to a tradition of black military service and sacrifice that stretched back to Crispus Attucks. As we approach the end of this incredible story, I want to remind you one more time about the power you have to spread these important historical narratives. If this video has taught you something, if it has moved you or made you think differently about American history, then please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. History belongs to all of us, but only if we make the effort to learn it and share it. These stories matter. Your engagement helps ensure they reach more people. Now, let's bring this story home. The end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865 officially abolished enslavement throughout the United States. It had taken nearly a century from the death of Crispus Attucks, but the promise of freedom had finally been legally extended to all people within the nation's borders. This was not the end of the struggle for equality and justice, of course. The period of Reconstruction that followed the war saw tremendous progress, but also violent resistance. Jim Crow laws, segregation, and systematic discrimination would plague the nation for another century. But the legal foundation had been laid, and it was built in part on the sacrifices of people like Crispus Attucks. In 1888, a monument to Crispus Attucks and the victims of the Boston Massacre was erected on Boston Common. The monument stands 25 feet high and includes bronze reliefs depicting the massacre. At the dedication ceremony, a speaker reminded the crowd that Attucks had been the first to defy and the first to die in the cause of American liberty. The monument served as a physical reminder that the story of American freedom was more complex and more inclusive than many had been willing to acknowledge. The 20th century saw renewed interest in the story of Crispus Attucks as the civil rights movement gained momentum. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders often referenced the long history of black Americans fighting for freedom, and Crispus Attucks featured prominently in these historical narratives. The argument was clear. Black Americans had been patriots and freedom fighters from the very beginning. They had fought in every American war, they had contributed to every aspect of American life, and they deserved full equality as citizens. The sacrifices of people like Attucks provided powerful evidence for these claims. Today, Crispus Attucks is remembered in numerous ways. Schools, parks, and streets bear his name across the country. March 5th is sometimes commemorated as Crispus Attucks Day. Historians continue to research and write about his life and death, seeking to understand the full context and meaning of his sacrifice. The basic facts of his story, that he was a man of color, that he had escaped from enslavement, that he was the first to die in the Boston Massacre, are well established. But the deeper questions about his motivations, his thoughts, and his understanding of what he was fighting for remain subjects of discussion and interpretation. What is clear is that Crispus Attucks understood something fundamental about freedom. He understood that it was worth risking everything to claim it for yourself. He understood that there are moments when you must stand up, even in the face of overwhelming power, even when the odds are against you. He understood that sometimes one person's courage can inspire thousands, that one person's sacrifice can change the course of history, Attucks did not know that he would become a symbol of resistance and freedom. He could not have known that his name would be remembered more than 2 centuries later. But in that moment on that frozen street in Boston, he chose to stand at the front. He chose to confront injustice. And in doing so, he became immortal. The story of how one enslaved person in Boston was responsible for the freedom of thousands is not a simple story of cause and effect. Crispus Attucks did not single-handedly end enslavement in America. No single person could have done that. But his actions, his sacrifice, and the meaning that people drew from his story contributed to a growing movement that eventually did break the chains of bondage. His death at the Boston Massacre provided abolitionists with a powerful symbol and argument. His courage inspired others to take risks for freedom. His story demonstrated that people of African descent were fully capable of the highest forms of patriotism and sacrifice. The broader lesson of Crispus Attucks's life is about the power of individual action within collective movements. Attucks was one man, but he was part of a community of people who valued freedom. He stood at the front of a crowd that night in March 1770, but he was not alone. The abolitionist movement that used his story to advance their cause was made up of thousands of individuals, each making choices and taking actions. The freedom seekers who escaped via the Underground Railroad, the activists who formed vigilance committees, the soldiers who fought in the Civil War. Each was an individual, but together they formed an irresistible force for change. This is perhaps the most important message we can take from the story of Crispus Attucks. Change happens because individuals choose to act, even when the outcome is uncertain, even when the personal cost is high. The great movements of history are built on the accumulated choices of ordinary people who decide that they will not accept injustice, that they will take a stand, that they will risk something for the sake of a better world. Crispus Attucks was such a person. The thousands who followed his example, who drew inspiration from his sacrifice, who continued the fight for freedom long after he was gone, they were such people. Today, as we face our own challenges and injustices, the story of Crispus Attucks reminds us that we have agency, that our actions matter, that history is not made only by famous names and powerful institutions, but by people who decide to stand up. It reminds us that the struggle for freedom is never finally won, that each generation must defend and extend the liberties that previous generations fought for. And it reminds us that sometimes the most unlikely people, those whom society has discounted or marginalized, turn out to be the heroes that history remembers. The mysterious enslaved person of Boston was not so mysterious after all. His name was Crispus Attucks. He was a man who understood the value of freedom because he had lived without it. He was a man who had the courage to escape from bondage and live on his own terms. And he was a man who, when the moment came, stood at the front and faced tyranny head-on, paying the ultimate price, but lighting a fire that would eventually burn away the chains of millions. His story is not just a story of the past. It is a story for today, a reminder that freedom is always fragile, always contested, and always worth fighting for. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's most powerful and inspiring stories. If you've made it this far, I truly hope you found value in learning about Crispus Attucks and his incredible impact on the fight for freedom. This is exactly the kind of content we're passionate about creating, uncovering the hidden stories that shaped our world. Please make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next video. Hit that like button to help YouTube show this video to more people who need to hear this story. And share this with anyone you think would appreciate learning about true heroes of history. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Did you know about Crispus Attucks before this video? What other historical figures do you want to learn about? Your comments and engagement help guide what we create next. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep standing up for what's right.